Have you ever been fishing a hatch with fish rising everywhere and you are throwing what you think is the perfect fly, but the fish just completely ignore it? Yeah, it happens a lot. Happens a lot to me too, a lot more than I'd care to admit. But often I've found that it happens because a lot of anglers don't fully understand how to successfully fish with emergers. These are one of the most important flies that you will ever learn about, and knowing how to fish them well is important if you want to have success during any kind of dry fly hatch. And during a hatch, I will almost always have an emerger tied on, whether it's a second fly in a 2 dry fly rig or the only dry fly. They just flat out work. Fish love them. And once you understand what an emerger is, you're going to realize why they're so effective. They're also really easy to fish. You don't need any special techniques or to do anything different or a whole new rod setup. So they're really simple, and you're going to want to keep listening to today's episode, and you will find out all about how you can successfully fly fish with emergers. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled. I am your host, Spencer Durrant, and this is the most exciting 45 minutes of your life until next week when you listen to the next episode of Untangled, and that becomes the most exciting 45 minutes of your life because we strive to improve here each and every week at the VFC Institute for Advanced Angling Studies. Oh, folks, I'm happy to be here. It's always a great time. I love doing this show. Love getting the chance to talk fishing with y'all. And we've got quite a few topics to dive into tonight. We're going to be talking all about how to pick the right rod and line for saltwater fishing, how to keep your flies from falling apart, how to find a big fish, fishing with emergers, and how to pick a good dropper. So we've got a lot to get into, and we are just going to dive right into our short questions. For any of our new listeners, I like to start the show off every week with a couple of shorter questions that they may not necessitate that really in-depth 10, 15-minute long answer, but they're still questions that a lot of us, if not all of us, probably have at some point about fly fishing. So they're worth getting into, worth answering, which, again, as a reminder, no question is too small. I want to answer every single one of them. They're my Pokemon, and I've got to catch them all, or answer them all, or something like that, right? Are the kids still into that Pokemon thing, or is that a 90s kid thing? I don't know anymore. Anyways, there's always a link in the podcast description for you to submit your questions if you happen to have any, and I'm sure you do. So click the link in the podcast description, submit your question. It will get answered here on the show. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into it. George from Kansas writes in. He's going to kick us off this week. George says, we'll be traveling to Oahu for a few months, and I'm looking to target bonefish and giant trevally. What size rod would you recommend, and any specific gear or flies that I should look into getting and or tying? Well, George, it sounds like a great trip. A little jealous of you because it's finally cold here in Wyoming. We got a lot of snow. The elk are out of the mountains now, so it's officially winter here in Wyoming. For your trip, though, George, you're definitely going to want an 8-weight. I would recommend getting the nicest 8-weight you can afford. I was talking with a really good friend of mine. He's a big guru at one of the big fly fishing companies, and we were chatting about 8-weights, and I was asking his opinion on a couple of 8-weights. And I mentioned about picking up this one model, and he said, well, what are you going to use it for? Are you going to just chuck it for salmon in Alaska, or do you think you're going to use that ever in the salt for more precise casting for bonefish or permit? And I said, well, probably both. I'll probably get to bonefish and permit at some point. And he said, well, you're going to want to buy this other one that's a lot nicer because it's a much more accurate, much more precise rod. So that's where my 2 cents comes in there, George. My buddy was right. And I've noticed that 8-weight, it's a spendy 8-weight that I have, worth every penny because it is so accurate. It's such a good rod, and it can do kind of everything you want an 8-weight to do, but it's got the accuracy portion of it too, which is important for bone fishing. A good reel is also incredibly important. It can honestly make or break your ability to land some of those fish. I know a lot of salt anglers love hatch and nautilus reels, so I definitely look into those. But if you have a reel that's got a solid disc drag, you should be fine. I will look into getting some tropical fly line. However, I know Scientific Anglers makes line that's tropical centered. I believe Airflow does and Rio does. So 3 of the biggest companies are making line geared for saltwater fishing. So I'd definitely take a look at what they have to offer just so you can see, make sure you get the right line for the situation that you're going to be in. It does make a difference. So good question, George. I appreciate that. Thank you for sending it in. And our next short question comes to us from Utah. Ryan from Utah writes in and says, how do I keep my flies from falling apart? I'm new to tying flies, and when I use the flies I tie, they fall apart very quickly. What can I do to fix that? Well, Ryan, this is a pretty common problem, so don't feel like you're doing anything weird or wrong or that it's only your flies that are falling apart, because I had plenty of my beginning flies fall apart on me, so it happens to all of us. Usually, though, when flies fall apart, it is due to 2 major things. You're either trying to tie in too much material at the head of the fly so the thread becomes loose and it doesn't seat the knots well. And if the thread's loose and the knots aren't seated, everything's just going to kind of fall apart on you. Or your whip finish doesn't have enough tension when you're doing it to properly seat the knot. So make sure that you're leaving plenty of room behind the eye of the hook so you have enough room to do a good head when you're finishing your fly, but make sure that your head is small. You don't want this giant ball of thread on there. That's not going to be good for you either. I do a 4 to 5 turn whip finish on almost all my flies. I try to keep really good tension on it throughout the knot. And then I always use head cement as well. I've got some of Dave's Flex Cement from the late Dave Whitlock. I believe Rainey's Flies sells it. I don't know if anybody else sells the actual Dave's Flex Cement. I'm sure they do. It comes in a Rainey's bottle, is what I'm meaning. But the Rainey's Dave Flex Cement is what I use. I love it. I know a lot of guys who love super glue. I know a lot of guys who swear by Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails. So really, you just pick one that you like and go with it. But a head cement is a good option, but it won't do anything for you unless your knots are good. So you need to make sure that those whip finishes, that you're keeping enough tension on the line to seat the knots well, and that you have enough room for them to lay on the fly without bulking everything up too much. And if you do that, you should be in good shape. So thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that question. And without further ado, let's jump into the main part of this week's show. Ian from South Dakota is going to lead us off this week with his question. He writes in and says, where do I find big trout in a place infested with small trout? Well, Ian, that's a really good question. And I actually just wrote an article about this for Hatch Magazine. I write over there pretty regularly. I also write for Midcurrent as well. So if y'all subscribe to Midcurrent or Hatch Magazine or both, a lot of my writing's in there as well. Anyways, I'll link this story in the podcast description. I had a lot of fun digging into it and looking at what are the ingredients, if you will, that you need to add to a river to get big fish, even if there are a ton of small fish in it. And what I found is you're looking for, in general, a place that has the following features. If there's hope for it to grow big fish, it needs to have these 5 things. I had to count them up real quick. I didn't give myself a number here. I wrote them down, but I didn't write the number of them. So you need a large forage base. You need space to grow, relatively low pressure, a longer growing season, and low competition. Now, I'm going to dig into all of those in a little bit more detail here, but those are the 5 things that you need. And if you're missing maybe one of those 5, you could probably get some bigger fish, but you really do need all 5 if you want to grow a big trout. And this was geared towards creeks and streams that are not tailwaters. Tailwaters are almost the exception to the rule because there's so much food in the tailwater that even though there are a ton of fish and a ton of pressure, if you think of some of our famous tailwaters, the Bighorn in Montana, the Green in Flaming Gorge down there in Utah, those tailwaters are just getting smashed with people But the fish are big because there's just so much food for them to eat that the pressure doesn't really impact them as much as you see on the more wild streams. The one kind of wild stream that I think maybe, well, the Madison, maybe to an extent. I mean, the Madison's still dam controlled a little bit. So maybe I was just going to say the South Fork of the Snake, but it's dam controlled too. The Yellowstone, really, that doesn't have a dam on it. That's one of the few rivers that doesn't have a dam on it. And the fish are decent size there, but that's mostly due to, I mean, there's a lot of pressure there, but there's just a lot of food in that river too. So anyways, I'll dig into these in detail and we'll recap here in a minute. But let's start off with a large forage base. If you're going to grow big fish, they've got to have something to eat. So you need a large forage base, not only a lot of bugs, but a lot of variety of bugs too. The little stream by my house, the bug life there is pretty incredible. There's a ton of stoneflies. There's a lot of mayflies. There's a lot of caddis and a lot of good terrestrial action as well. So, and then there's plenty of midges on top of that. So you really have a nice smorgasbord, if you will, of food for these fish to eat year round. There's always something hatching. There's always something skittering around down there for the trout to eat. And I think that's part of why the fish there are larger on average than a lot of the other small streams here in my corner of Wyoming, because they have a lot of food to eat. Now, they'd grow bigger if the stream gradient was a little bit better. It's a really steep stream, so there's just not a lot of holding water. And we'll get into that in a minute. But you want a large forage base. They need a lot of food to eat. They need a lot of options to eat if they're going to grow big. And that includes other fish. So when they get really big, we talk brown trout when they get up to, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but let's just say, for sake of argument, when they get to 16 inches, their diet's not still going to be only bugs. It's also going to be other fish at that point. Now, I'm sure below 16 inches, they'll try and eat each other. I'm no biologist. I'm just, for the sake of argument, let's say if you want to get a fish past 15, 16 inches, there needs to be enough small fish for the big fish to eat. They're cannibalistic. They like to do that. And there needs to be enough fish there to really, if you want to grow something big, they've got to be able to eat each other a little bit. As macabre as that sounds, it's kind of true. All right, now let's go down to that space to grow thing. I talked about this just a second ago, the little stream by my house. It would grow bigger fish if there were more pools, more good holding water. It is a very steep river. It falls, from up top. I'm just trying to think. I've fished it up top at almost 9,000 feet, and I'm at 3,000, like 3,800 feet here at my house. So that's, let's call it 5,000 feet elevation change in maybe 20 miles. So it is steep. It is just falling down the side of this mountain. So it's all pocket water, but the pockets aren't super deep. So there's not a ton of room for the fish to grow very big. The biggest fish are down at the bottom of the river where it levels out a little bit, and there's a lot of big, deep pools. There's a place for them to hang out. So your streams do need to have that kind of room for the fish to like stretch and relax and, buy an easy chair and set up shop and start selling knickknacks and stuff. Because, if a trout can't make itself a home, how's a trout supposed to get big, fat, and happy? If you're always on the move, you're going to be skinny, right? Well, I wish that was true for humans, but it ain't. I'm living proof of that. I'm on the move a lot, and well, dang if I'm not getting fat these days. And anyways, this ain't about me. It's about the fish, right? So they do need some space to grow. You're also looking for places that have relatively low pressure. Mentioned this earlier. Tailwaters are the exception to a lot of these rules. That's why tailwaters are so magical, because the fish are all big. There's tons of pressure. There's a lot of food, and there's usually a boatload of space for those fish to hang out as well. So the pressure does kind of even out a little bit in that sense. But if you're looking for creeks and streams where the fish are going to grow big, generally the more and more that you fish a place, not just you as a person, but that a place gets fished by tons of anglers, the smaller the fish are going to be. I actually, in this article that I wrote for Hatch magazine, I found this really interesting study that correlated the size of halibut with increased angling pressure over in, oh shoot, I forget where it was. But it was really interesting because the more and more people that were fishing for halibut, the smaller the average size of halibut became. And it holds true for trout as well. The more and more pressure you get, usually the smaller the size is going to be. So you're looking for a place that is not just pounded the snot out of all the time. You want a place that a little out of the way. There's probably a better chance you're going to find a big fish there than on the creek through town that everybody fishes because there's just tons of fish in there. You're also looking for a place that has a longer growing season. So you want to make sure that the time that the fish have to grow, that they're not under ice or under a bunch of snow, is pretty long. That's why a lot of these high country streams, they're pretty prolific as far as the food, and they might have a ton of space for fish to grow, but really those fish only have like June, July, and August to grow because September rolls around and it starts getting cold again, and when it gets cold, the bug activity tapers off, and when the bug activity tapers off, the fish activity tapers off too. So there needs to be a nice longer growing season, a year-round growing season. That's part of what makes tailwaters so special because it's a stable water temperature year-round. So even though the bugs are going to be acting differently, a lot of the midges, a lot of the other bugs like your sow bugs, your aquatic invertebrates and whatnot, they are going to be still active the whole year because the tailwater's staying at that stable temperature. And then the last thing you're looking for is low competition. What I mean by low competition is you don't want to have too many fish in the river. Think of any high mountain lake you've been to that has brook trout in it. There's probably a bazillion of them, and they're probably all about yay long. If you're watching the video podcast, I'm holding up my fingers about 3 inches apart because they're all tiny. They overpopulate, they stunt, and the next thing you know, there's too many mouths to feed. There's not enough food to go around. So that kind of goes into the forage-based thing, but also you want to make sure there's not too many fish. And like I said, if one of those is knocked out, you might be able to find big fish in a place. But if you got 2 or more of those that you can't check off on your list, then you're probably not going to find big fish there. Some streams just don't grow big trout. It'd be nice if they all grew big trout, but they don't. So there's only so much we can do to influence that. But that's how you find big fish. That's what you want to look for if you are looking for a place that might have big fish in amongst those smaller ones. Those are the things that stream needs to have. So I appreciate that question, though, Ian. Thank you for sending that one on in. This question is the one that teased in the hook of the show. It's one of the title. We're talking all about emergers. And we have Chris from Utah to thank for sending this one in. Chris wrote in, said, what is the difference between a dun, a spinner, a cripple, etc.? How should I decide when to use any of those compared to a normal dry fly like a parachute? Along with that, how do I decide when to use an emerger and what are the strategies for using those? Chris, this is a really, really good question. I love this one. And I really like that you're digging into some of the meat and potatoes of fly fishing here. I really do enjoy that. So I would advise everybody to get comfortable because we're going to be on this topic for a minute. So grab your Diet Coke because we all know Diet Coke is the premier beverage of choice among those of us who do not drink. I am one of those. So I do love my Diet Coke. When I need the hard stuff, I bust out the Mountain Dew. All right. Anyways, grab whatever beverage you like. Get comfortable. We are going to be on this topic for a minute because there is a lot to discuss here. So, like I mentioned in the hook for this episode, emergers are a really effective fly that a lot of folks, they just don't understand them. They hear the phrase, they've seen them for sale at the fly shop or on the VFC website because, I mean, let's be real, you're buying your flies from us. I know you are, right? Because we have the best. So I'm just saying. Anyways, you see emergers kicking around and you just don't, what are they? Why would you use them? How do you use them? Like Chris said, what are the strategies for using these? So I'm going to answer Chris's question about the difference between flies, and then I'm going to go into detail on how to fish emergers themselves. So let's break down what he said. A dun is the adult version of a bug. It is alive and well. It is happy. It's mating. That's their kind of their whole point. They hatched so they can mate and make more bugs. So that's their whole thing here. Not to get into birds and bees and whatnot on VFC Untangled, but I guess we are a little bit. It's kind of awkward. Uh, anyways, that's what they're there for, right? The duns are the adult version. They're healthy, they're happy, and they're mating. That's what you want to remember about the dun version of an aquatic insect. A spinner is the dead version of that bug that falls back down to the water after it's finished mating. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to as a spent wing. A cripple is a crippled version of a dun that is still stuck in the surface film. An emerger, for those who don't know, is the emerging version of an insect that is often stuck in the surface film. And you're going to hear me refer to the surface film a lot. Really, what happens if you look at a river, a lake, any water, really, there's a little bit of tension at the surface of that where there's almost, I'm not going to say microscopic, but there's a discernible film on the surface where there's a little bit of tension and you break that tension and then you start to sink. So you're either above it or below it. And then right in between is that surface film. If you guys are watching, I'm holding my fingers up really closely. The surface film is not very big. You've got floating on top of the water. You've got underneath and sinking. And in between is this tiny little zone called the surface film. And a lot of bugs will get stuck there because they have to break through that tension as they are hatching, as they are emerging. They've got to break through that tension and get out and become the full duns that they are if they hatch in the water, because not all aquatic insects do hatch in the water. Some of them do, some of them don't, and that's a discussion for another day. But if they're coming up out of the bottom of the water and they get stuck in that surface film, that's the location that we're talking about. You will see a lot of bugs there. You'll notice it the next time you go out on the river. So to understand when you're going to use them, now that we know what the differences are, to understand when, to answer Chris's question there, when do I pick the emerger versus the cripple versus the dun versus the regular, the whatever it is, we need to understand rise forms. That's where you will be informed on what fly to fish mainly by the rise forms. So a rise form is exactly what it sounds like. For those of you who don't know, a rise form, it is just the disturbance that a fish makes when it eats a bug off the surface of the water. Now, if you're watching the video podcast, you're going to have a fancy graphic popping up on your screen right about now that talks about rise forms. As you can see, when trout eat emergers, they just barely break through the surface to do so because, again, those emergers are stuck in the surface film, or maybe they're not even in the surface film yet. They're still just kind of floating under the surface a little bit, and they're about to shoot up and hatch. They're just kind of hanging out. They're below the surface a tiny bit. And when trout come up to eat those bugs, you are only going to see the fish's back and tail fin break the surface. It's a very soft, very subtle eat. And again, you'll just see the dorsal fin and the tail fin break the surface. It almost looks like the trout just kind of levitates up and the back and the tail fin break the surface, and then it levitates back down. And honestly, that's kind of the motion that the trout are making anyways. When trout eat a dun or any other bug that is on the surface of the water, like a grasshopper or an ant, you are going to see the trout's head and nose break through the surface of the water. This rise will often be a lot louder, maybe a bit splashier than an emerger eat. So if you see a fish making a rise that looks like they're just eating emergers, that's when you want to tie an emerger on. Now, when trout rise to eat a cripple or a spinner, it is going to look very similar to an emerger eat. You'll know to fish cripples and spinners kind of based on the hatch timing. So if they're eating spinners, it's usually happening later in the hatch once there are dead bugs on the water. So if you get there and the hatch is just kind of barely started, they probably won't take a spinner right off the bat. They will generally take a cripple at any point throughout the hatch because it's an easy meal for them to target. That's a lot of reason why they love emergers so much, because they're stuck in the surface film. They can't go anywhere. They're an easy target. The duns can flutter away. They might, bounce off the fish's nose or whatever. The duns at least can escape a tiny bit. The emergers really can't. So the trout love them because they're such an easy target. And that's why even in the middle of a very prolific hatch, if there's a ton of duns on the water, trout will still go for the cripple or the emerger sometimes because it's easier. Now, if the hatch is just ridiculous and they're keyed in on the duns, then you'll need to tie a dun on. But I've found that those instances are a lot more rare than the instances where the fish will just go ahead and eat the emerger often throughout the whole hatch. I've had that happen before. Now, at the beginning of the hatch would be a good time to fish emergers. Then you kind of move to duns and cripples when the hatch is in full swing. So, beginning of the hatch is when you want your emergers, duns and cripples when the hatch is in full swing, and then your spinners when the hatch is nearing its end. And if you're not sure on hatch timing, again, just watch what's on the water. So if you see a lot of dead bugs that aren't moving, it's spinner time. If you see a lot of bugs that are actively bouncing around and doing stuff, it's probably a dun time. But then if you look at the rise forms and you see that it looks like they're eating emergers, well, I'd tie an emerger on at that point. You really just need to observe a little bit during those hatches to see exactly what they're eating. And then once you've paid a little bit of attention, you've got enough information, you go ahead and you make that fly choice, and boom, you're in business right after that. It's really kind of nice. We actually have an entire ebook on how to pick the right fly for a hatch just like this that I've described. The ebook's free. I've linked it in the podcast description. So definitely go ahead and check that out if you're interested. It's there for y'all. Now, this does bring us to the whole concept of fishing with emergers. I think we covered pretty well what they are and why they work so well. They're the emerging form of the bug. It is hatched. It is no longer a larva or a pupa stage. It is coming up through the water column. It's ready to hatch and spread its wings, literally, and get out there and be in charge. It's looking to be the big man on campus, right? The big bug out there. It's ready to take its first sip of bug alcohol or whatever it is. It's an adult, dadgummit. It's ready to spread its wings and fly. It's happy. And that's what the emerger is. It is right there on the doorstep. Okay, it is right there. But again, they get stuck in that surface film, so they're a lot easier to go ahead and eat, and that's why the fish love them so much. But how do we fish with these bugs? What do we do with them? We know what they are. We know why fish love them, but how do we fish with them? Well, really, I think I've found what trips most folks up with fishing emergers. I think, it's just my opinion, but from the folks that I've guided and from the people that I fish with, a lot of folks have issues fishing with them just because of their size. And they're pretty hard to see. Usually, most of the emergers I fish are a size 16 to a size 20. I think probably the most common size I use is like a size 18. But with bugs like this, it's hard to see them on their own since they sit so low in the surface film. Yeah, you could just tie one on, throw it up, and then if a fish rises where you think your fly is, you set the hook. But that's not a very effective way to fish. It works if there's a bad glare on the water or if you just can't fish two flies for whatever reason. I've done it, and it works. It's kind of an art form that you get used to at some point, but I don't really like doing it if I don't have to. I like to be able to see. So what I usually do is I tie on the larger dun version of whatever's hatching. Even if the duns aren't out in force yet, I'm still going to do that. And then I take some 5 or 6X tippet, depending on how clear the water is and how small the bugs are. And I'll tie on about 2 feet of that off the bend of the hook of my dun, and then I fish the emerger there. So I've got a 2 dry fly rig. And I love this rig because the bigger dry fly is acting almost as my indicator. It's easy to spot, and once I've found it, I can follow it up to where my emerger is. And if the emerger is still really hard to see, if it's too small or if it's sinking a lot, then I can actually watch to see if my dun moves when a fish rises, and I know to set the hook because it ate my emerger. Right, to give you an example, I was out on the Firehole River a few weeks ago with a buddy of mine, and we got there right as the blue wing hatch started coming off. It was like noon. We timed it perfect. We couldn't have timed it better if we tried, to be honest. It was wonderful. And we get there, the hatch starts coming off, and I telltale emerger rises. I just see these fish eating. I just see the dorsal fin and the tail fin breaking the surface. So I tie an emerger on. One of my favorite little emerger patterns is a sparkle dun. That is one of the best flies ever. I have dozens of them in my box at all times. They're just wonderful flies. I can't tell you how much I love sparkle duns. Anyways, I tied it on, I threw it up, and because of the light, it was really drizzly, and it was kind of that gray, flat light. I couldn't see squat. And I'm sure I missed a bunch of fish rising to it, but I couldn't see them. So I brought it in. I tied on an adult blue-winged olive, and then I threw the emerger up there. And once I had something I could see that I could actually follow to where the emerger was, and I could watch that dun move when the fish ate the emerger, I started getting into fish. So it works. It's a good technique. I use it all the time. It's something I would definitely recommend. A couple other things to think about when you're fishing with emergers is setting the hook, because you want to pay attention to how that fish is eating when you cast to it, or how all the fish are eating. If they're eating slow, which they like to do when they're eating emergers, then your hook set needs to be slower. I went over this in a recent episode. I think it was episode 42. I could be wrong on that. I think it was episode 42. But essentially, you want to slow down your hook set a bit in these instances. If the fish are coming up and being really slow about their eats, you don't want to just set the hook immediately. It really does pay to wait, watch the fish go down with your fly before you set the hook. It does help if you're having a hard time watching the fish actually go down. If you see them rise, then you could say something out loud like, "God save the Queen." But you have to say it with a stiff upper lip and a British accent, or else it doesn't count. And then you set the hook at that point. So that's one way that you can do it. Another thing to remember here, I do like to use a powder floatant on my emergers if I feel like they need to float. But I really don't do that to them very much because they're supposed to sit lower in the water anyways. If the fish are ignoring it, then you can try floating it a little bit higher, but you probably won't need to. Unless it's like sinking 2 feet below the surface, it's going to be fine. And even then, I've had fish smack it. I mean, an RS2 is essentially just, it's kind of a hybrid emerger pattern, but I know guys who fish RS2s as the bottom fly in a nymph rig, and they catch tons of fish. So it really, if you feel like it needs to float, I like a powder floatant. But really, you don't need to worry about it floating super high, but you do need to be able to see your dry fly, or your dun, pardon me. And then if you're in a situation where you're casting, let's say you're not casting directly upstream, you're casting across and the fly is drifting downstream of you a little bit. When you get to the end of that, add a little bit of a swing to your fly, because sometimes that can trigger a strike, especially with those emergers, because that swing imitates a very natural motion that emergers make as they kind of shoot up through the water. So hopefully that answers your question there. I really appreciate you sending that one on in to us, Chris. It's always great to sit and chat emergers with everybody, so thank you a bunch for that question. Scott from Indiana is going to round this out for us tonight before we get into story time. So don't go anywhere. Don't touch those dials. Wait, this is a podcast. You can't touch a dial. That's a radio thing. Don't touch your phone. Stay right here with us, folks. You're not going to want to miss story time coming up next with Spencer. Okay, annoying DJ voice is over. Let's get back to the show here. Scott from Indiana has our last question today. He writes in and says, when fishing a dry nymph, should they match or contrast if there is multiple species around? So, Scott, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if you should mix and match, I can talk, mix and match nymphs with dry flies. Like, should you fish a caddis dry and a mayfly nymph? Am I hearing you correct? I hope so, because that's how I'm going to answer your question for you. So, should you mix and match species of insects with your dry dropper rigs? Well, the answer is abso-freaking-lutely. You should definitely do that. It's freaking fantastic. It's a great thing to do. I'm always mixing up my dry dropper rigs because there's almost always a few different bugs present. When I'm out fishing with Alex and Berkeley, for example, it's kind of a running joke that I'm going to catch all of my fish on a zebra midge. Alex is going to get his on some sort of caddis imitation. And I feel like, and I might be wrong, I feel like he had a sow bug that he was using a bunch a while ago that he was just slaying fish on. But Alex is the guy with caddis imitations, man. He's got some caddis emerger type things just dialed. Caddis pupa too. He knows his stuff. And then Berkeley's kind of a jack of all trades guy. I asked him about this question. He texted me. I need to pull it up here. Uh, eh, Berkeley's kind of our jack of all trades dude. He'll I don't know that he had a super strong favorite nymph, but what he said to me is that he said, I sort of had a year of being a rebel and trying new patterns. He wasn't using his normal go-to patterns. He said he was having a ton of success with the 20-inch stonefly and the golden stovefly. Threw them on a bunch this year, and they were very effective. So that's been Berkeley's go-to lately. So there's three of us, right? I'm fishing midges. Alex is going with the caddis, and Berkeley's been with his stoneflies for the last year about, and among other things that he's tried. So we're all fishing different nymphs and different dries all the time. And you want to know this, and this is worth talking about in detail because I think it's the key to a lot of success. There's not always just going to be like one species of fly that the fish are going to be eating. Just like there's never any magic bullet fly. It can feel like that on some days, but it's always about presentation. Okay, well, I'm going to walk that back. 99% of the time, it's about presentation. There are some times when you get into a hatch, like if there's blue wings hatching and you throw an October caddis out there, you're probably not going to catch any fish. But there is no like magic bullet, like, oh, this fly's going to work all the time type thing. My usual rig, let me give you an example. All right, my usual rig in the summer here in the Rockies is a hopper with some kind of stonefly nymph underneath. And if I'm if I'm fishing a really deep hole, I tie on a Perdigon or a zebra midge dropper. If I'm on smaller water, I really like a size 14 Adams, a size 16 Frenchie, and a size 18 zebra midge. I'm hitting two different bug species in that last rig, if you listen to it, caddis and midges. And then mayfly, really, if you count the Adams, because it's kind of a do-it-all thing. Both of those, well, all three of those, mayflies, caddis, and midges, they're abundant everywhere. In just about every trout river, you're going to find a ton of those bugs, especially out here in the West. So it's worth mixing and matching like that because you never know exactly what fish are going to be keyed in on any given day. So it's good to just go ahead and throw a lot of things at the wall and see what sticks. Another thing to consider here is the depth at which you're fishing your droppers. I fish my zebra midge as the bottom fly in almost every rig, and coincidentally, I think I've caught more fish on a zebra midge than any other fly that I ever use. So is it the fly or is it the depth? Well, that's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's a mix of both, but probably has a lot more to do with the presentation or the depth at which I'm fishing it. I think it is worth experimenting, though, so you can dial in what works. I've switched to, I shouldn't say switched, I've started using a Perdigon a lot more in my local stream because it is so effective. For whatever reason, they just love it. I had one on for one day. I can't remember why I tied it on, but I caught a boatload of fish on it. And so I started tying more and catching a bunch of fish on them the more and more I use them. So they're just really effective here. That they really like them for whatever reason, more so than my zebra midge almost, which is interesting. But I've kind of mixed and matched, and that Perdigon, though, is the last fly in my rig, just like the zebra midge would be. So it might really just be a depth thing. Who knows? But the final thing, on my local stream, there's a big population of stoneflies. So I always have some kind of stonefly tied on my rig. But there are a lot of caddis and mayflies too. So I do like to have at least one of those bugs represented. So what it really boils down to is that if you're fishing a dry dropper rig, you have the opportunity to present various bugs to trout so that you can see what they really like, and it's just good practice. So definitely do it. I like that question there, Scott. Thanks for sending that on in. And don't go anywhere, folks, because up next, it's story time. All right, story time this week. I'm digging back into the history books, folks. I'm going to talk shop about fishing the Provo back in Utah, the low pro, back when it was public land, too. This was a while back, because some wonderful developer from California, because aren't they all from California? I'm not bitter at all, am I? Anyways, some feller from California came in and bought a bunch of land and decided he wasn't going to let anybody on it anymore, like it had been for, since the 70s. And now you can't fish this spot. But back when you could fish this spot, there was this little run on the Provo. And if anybody's fished the lower Provo, I'm sure they know which run I'm talking about. But it's a run that's famous for having a bunch of big rainbows in it. And I would go religiously 2-3 nights a week. I would go up to this run. And I kind of had it timed to where I would be the only guy there. Usually, sometimes there were people there and I'd fish below or above them. But I usually was able to fish this run at least 2-3 times a week. I get to this little run, and I'd caught almost every time I'd hooked into a big rainbow. But I'd landed out of this hole. I'd landed 2 really big rainbows. One was about 20 inches. The other was about 18, but they're fat. On the Provo, the rainbows are generally football shaped. They're just thick. All right, they need to go on a diet because they're about to develop trout diabetes. I'm really worried for them. Anyways, they're big fish, right? So I was doing this over the course of months, if not a year. I would just religiously fish this spot because I knew there was a big fish in there and I wanted to catch him. So I was really working on trying to dial it in. I was trying all sorts of different flies. I was adjusting my nymph rigs, my depth. I would sit there. I remember one Sunday, I sat there and cast and cast and cast. I think I was on that hole for 3 hours. And you wouldn't have thought it paid off, but I either finally bothered the fish enough or I got the fly just in the right spot and it ate. And it was that one of those big rainbows I caught. I think it was the 18-incher I caught that day. I remember them both because they were pretty memorable, the fish that you got out of there. But I remember just going through every single fly that I had and really trying to figure out what they wanted that day. I was experimenting a lot, and this was really good for me. I didn't realize at the time how good it was for me, but I was forcing myself to experiment and to change and to learn and to try different things, all within the confines of one hole. So I was hyper-focused on one result, but it ended up being really good for me in the long run because I've been able to take that skill set and apply it elsewhere. But anyways, it was I think it was a March or April morning. It was before the water came up. The lower Provo is a tailwater, and the water usually comes up depending on snowpack. They'll turn the tubes on and it'll jump up 3 or 4 feet. Now, usually right after the blue wing hatch really kind of hits its peak, then the water comes up. And I remember it was right before the water came up. I was there with a couple buddies. I don't remember who. I'm sorry if you remember the story, but I was there with a couple of my buddies, and I was on the hole, and one guy was above and one guy was below. And I'd caught 2 smaller browns out of there already, so I was feeling good because I'd had success on it. Feel pretty good about it, and I'm drifting my nymphs through, and I had this little fly on, a little midge pattern. A buddy of mine named Mike. Mysis Mike Kingsbury, heck of a guy. He called it the Chili Loco, is the name of it. And great little pattern. Love that stinking thing. And that was his name for it. I don't know if it's even like a quote unquote real pattern, but I fished it and caught a ton of fish on it. Well, I'm fishing this Chili Loco, and it's what I've caught all the big rainbows on so far. So I was feeling really confident about my little setup here. And my indicator's going by, and the indicator stops. I set the hook, and it felt like I was just stuck in moss. It's just that feeling where it kind of gives a little bit, but it's just so heavy. You're like, oh, dang it, it's more moss. Well, and then the moss moved, and I realized I'd hooked into a pretty pretty nice rainbow. So I tighten my drag down. I'm like a football player getting into a 3-point stance. Rod tip up, your drag's tight. Okay, I'm good to go. I'm not going to lose it. Cause I'm overthinking it, right? I don't want to lose this fish. And I looked at my buddy below me and my buddy above me. I'm like, guys, I got one. Get out. I don't want him to tangle. And they're really good buddies, actually. They got out of the water, and one of them grabbed a net, and I'm just sitting there, and this fish is taking me to school. In fact, it took me out behind the school, beat me up, took my lunch money, and called me a sissy. It was not good. This fish just making me look like I don't know what I'm doing. And I didn't really at this point. I had no clue what I was doing with a fish this big. I was pretty young when this happened. Young in my fly fishing career. It's going on for a minute, and this fish jumps a couple of times, and we can see it is a substantial fish. Now, I think earlier in this year, I'd caught a 27-inch rainbow out in Colorado with a buddy of mine, with Ryan, and my sis Mike was actually on that trip, and Ryan's son Josh. The four of us were out there together, and Mike and I both caught a pair of 27-inch rainbows, which was a ton of fun. And when this fish jumped here on the Provo, it looked every bit as big as that 27-inch fish from Mike. Now, I'm not saying it was a 27-incher. I'm saying it looked every bit as big. To my mind, it looked that big. I have no clue how big it was. It was over 20. I know that much. It looked big, but when they're that fat, it's kind of deceiving with how long they are. It might have only been 22, but it looked big. Well, it jumped a couple of times, and I start hollering. Well, this part of the lower Provo's got a road that goes right above it. And I remember there was a game and fish truck, Utah game and fish truck up there, or Department of Natural Resources, pardon me, as they call it in Utah. And he's up there, and I remember he stopped to watch this fight because I was hooked into this thing for 10-ish minutes because, like I said, it was taking me to school. And my buddy was getting close to it with the net, and every time I get close to it, it'd just shoot off, run into the moss, and I'm convinced I'm going to lose it. I'm freaking out. And we get past the 10-minute mark, and I'm starting to think I'm not going to land this fish. This is going to be really, really bad. And there was kind of a crowd. Like I said, there's a guy up on the hill. There's my two buddies, and I think there were a couple other anglers who were watching because I was making a ruckus because, the world evolved around me and my fish at that point. So everybody was going to know about it, dadgummit. Well, the fish makes one last run, and it gives those head shakes, a choo, 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 choo. And then there's that, you could almost hear it, just a ding, and the line goes slack. And the worst part was I'd kind of pulled the fish towards the net, and he was probably 4 or 5 feet from the net. And then he gave those head shakes, and then the hook popped free, and he scampered off. And I sat there for a minute. I disbelief, right? I wasn't going to accept what had just happened. I looked at my buddies, and they looked at me. None of us said anything. And the guy in the truck up on the hill, the DNR guy from Utah, I couldn't hear him, but he just rolled his window back up, and I swear I could see him shake his head like, oh, man, that sucks. And he drove off, and the river's just quiet. And I don't think we said anything. I think all three of us, we just walked back to my truck, and we were just kind of like, man, it was tough. So you lose fish sometimes. You do. And I've never hooked into a fish that felt that big on the lower Provo before or since. That was probably the biggest fish I was ever going to hook into on that river. Never. I've seen big fish on that river. There are some nice trout in there, but that one stands out in my memory because I never caught them. So it was a good time. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the story, and I hope you guys enjoy the show as well. If you've got any questions or feedback, comments, or concerns, please let us know. Rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. That helps us out a ton. And please don't forget, if you've got any questions, I would love to answer them. There's always that link in the podcast description. You can go ahead, click it, send your questions on in. Until next week, everybody, get out on the water, find some fish, touch some grass, experience what it is to be out fly fishing, and tie lines, everybody.